We are already halfway through the third season of this podcast, and I hope you're having as much fun listening to it as I am creating the episodes. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can find the links to our GoFundMe and Buy Me a Coffee in the episode description. Another way that you could show your support that is completely free is by sharing this episode with a friend or posting about it on your social media, as well as rating the podcast on whatever platform you're listening to. This allows us to reach more and more amazing people. This podcast is truly a labor of love, so any support that you can show us would be absolutely appreciated. Welcome to The Wheelchair Activist, a podcast hosted by me, Emma Vogelman, and every month I interview amazing members and allies of the disabled community who are quite literally changing the world. I am so excited for today's episode. Today we're talking to Jenna Bainbridge. She is an actor and singer who is currently on Broadway in the new Tony Award-winning musical Suffs. It's a show that I would absolutely love to see, so talking to Jenna was such a great way to learn more about it, as well as hear about her experiences navigating a career in the theater as a disabled performer. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Oh, Jenna, thank you so much for joining me on this episode of The Wheelchair Activist. Before I tell our listeners about how you were essentially like a pipe dream guest of mine, do you want to tell the lovely listeners a little bit about who you are?
Of course. Thank you, Emma, for having me today. This is such a thrill. My name is Jenna Bainbridge. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a disabled actor. I am an ambulatory wheelchair user, and I am currently performing in Suffs on Broadway, in which I am the first wheelchair user to ever appear in a new musical on Broadway.
Which couldn't be more impressive to me if you tried being a not only just a huge theater person, but musical theater as well, and also being a huge feminist. I mean, there are literally pictures of suffragettes on my wall right now as I'm looking up.
I love
And
that.
yeah, and my wonderful producer Kylie saw you perform in Sops a couple of months back, and she texted me that there was a character in a wheelchair and said, like, oh, wouldn't it be great if we could get you on the podcast, like, talk about the work and then you and all of that. And we sort of thought, well, I'm sure she's incredibly busy. There's absolutely no way that we're going to get her on the podcast. And lo and behold, it worked out. And here you are. So I couldn't be more excited.
Yeah, I was so excited when our PR team for Suffs reached out and said, like, hey, we found this podcast. Would you maybe want to be on it? Like it just felt like such kismet that we had kind of both reached out across the universe together. So
Yeah,
to connect.
clearly meant to be.
Yes.
Could, could you tell us a little bit about what is SUFS about?
Yeah. So Suffs, which is short for suffragist, is all about the passing of the 19th Amendment in the United States, which gave women, white women, the right to vote. And our story focuses primarily on the final 5 to 10 years of that fight, of the incredible women who really pushed it over the finish line to make sure that we got the right to vote. And it also deals with a lot of the injustices within the movement, as well as some of the tensions within the movement of people who are fighting for the same goal and using different tactics. And I think it's a really beautiful musical. It's also very funny. It has a ton of heart, and it really shines a light on a part of history that I certainly was never taught growing up. From what we have heard from our audiences, most people don't know this part of history, don't know about what happened between, Seneca Falls and the actual passing of the 19th Amendment, which is like a 60-year gap of history that we don't really talk about what happened during that time. And this musical really addresses that.
And what I thought was really interesting is like I grew up in the States, but I'm now UK based. But I think when we talk about the suffrage movement, a lot of our initial thinking goes to the English or the British suffrage movement,
Hmm.
with people like Emmeline Pankhurst and Millicent Fawcett. There's a statue of her in Parliament Square. And so I think it's really interesting that this piece of work covers the American movement, which I definitely never learned about in school either. I think, we don't learn enough about how different groups of people had to fight for the rights that they have
Hmm.
now. And I think it's so important that we do know that history so that we can see how much progress there's been, but how much more still needs to come and take a lot of inspiration from the people who came before and did the really hard things as they were then. Give us the push to do the damn hard things now.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things that our show really brings to light is how many, tried and true tactics that we now think of as being wonderful protest tactics. The first time that they happened in US history was with the suffragists. The first ever march on Washington was led by suffragists, and they wore all white and marched down in front of the White House. We also had a silent protest in front of the White House. So many of these tactics that we think of now of like, oh yeah, if you're going to protest, like get a sign, walk down the street. Like that was really created by Alice Paul and a lot of these suffragists. And many of the things that they did, they learned from the English suffragettes. Alice Paul worked alongside the English suffragettes and Lucy Burns, who is another character in our show. And they were arrested in England and they participated in the protests in the UK and then came back to the US and used some of the tactics that had been proven especially effective to continue the fight in the US.
I mean, that's so interesting. And what a precedent to have set. Marches are now, like you said, so synonymous with like protest and protest culture. And I think, we've seen some great marches happen, particularly in more recent years, when
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately circumstances have left us no other choice but to mass protest. And I think
Mm-hmm.
it's such an incredible bit of history to be telling an audience every time that you perform. But can you tell us a little? I mean, what is it like to be on Broadway? I can't believe I'm asking that question, but like, what's the experience like? And then I'd love to talk about like your history as an actor and how you got to this incredible role. But yeah, what's Broadway like, particularly as a disabled actor?
Yeah, Broadway is amazing. I grew up performing in musicals. I grew up in Denver, Colorado, and I always loved theater, always loved performing. I would watch the Tony Awards every year. I remember my parents taking me to New York when I was a teenager, and I got to see my first Broadway show was Rent. And these memories have stuck with me. I have always loved Broadway, and so finally getting to be on Broadway is I mean, it was like the ultimate pipe dream goal. And now to actually be here and living it every day is amazing. We get to tell this beautiful story 8 times a week to 1,000 people in one of the most beautiful theaters I've ever been in. But Broadway is also really hard. Part of why it is so incredible is that you work really hard to make it that incredible. And, doing 8 shows a week is exhausting. Also, the theaters that qualify as Broadway theaters were all built before the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So these theaters were not built with people with disabilities in mind. And it shows, it really shows. And our team at SUFS was incredible and put in a lot of work and time and money into making sure that it was accessible for me. But it reminds me daily that many, many, many people with disabilities are not able to perform on Broadway or even watch Broadway shows simply because of access.
No, completely. I mean, like I said, theater and musical fan. There are a lot of theaters in the UK that are unfortunately not accessible, in various ways. I remember I tried to book tickets for Wicked,
Mm.
and they said that the lift or something was a certain size, so I wasn't going to be able to get my particular electric wheelchair into the lift, and there was no other way that I could access a seat. So it was just sort of, okay, I guess I won't go see that.
Yeah,
But the disappointment in that, I found it incredibly upsetting, but sort of not surprising either. Like you said, these theaters were built
yeah,
before disabled people were out and about and demanding to, live their lives just like everyone else. And that includes,
mhm.
fun leisure activities. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
so in terms of access for your show, because I obviously just talked about like as a viewer, but how is
Mhm.
it behind the scenes? Like, is backstage and everything accessible, or do you find it's kind of worse? Is it better than front of house?
The way that a lot of the Broadway houses are built is that there's stage level, and then on either side of the stage are these two towers that contain all of the backstage spaces, including dressing rooms, wig rooms, costume departments. They're generally held in these two towers that go on either side of the stage and then connect above the stage and below the stage. So there's not really a ton of space from if you're in the audience watching the stage just outside of the curtain line. There's not a lot of space to the right and the left. Most of the space is actually vertical. And so when you're using those spaces, it means that for our theater, most of the dressing rooms are actually up on the fourth floor. And the building was built in the 1920s. So there's no elevator, there's no lift, and there's also no place to put an elevator or a lift because it's these small stairwells. And a lot of the rooms are like slightly opposite of each other. So there's not like a great space to put an elevator. And you would also have to do it on both sides of the stage because there's no way to connect like the second floor and the third floor because that would go directly through the actual theater, right? The actual stage itself. So there's crossover space on the fourth floor and in the basement. But as a wheelchair user, now I am an ambulatory wheelchair user, I am able to do stairs, but 8 shows a week, multiple times per day is not going to be possible for me, right? It's one thing for me to be like, I'm going to
Mm.
walk down to the band room once this week so I can like say hi to my friend playing cello, right? That's one thing. But saying like, I am going to run downstairs every single day, sometimes twice a day for shows to do a quick change is not going to be sustainable for me. And more importantly, I always want to create spaces that are going to be more accessible so that it doesn't just meet my own needs, it can meet any future person's needs as well. So that was the space we were given. There was just these two towers on the side of the stage and a basement, and that's not an accessible theater. So what our wonderful producing team did is first off, they built a ramp to the stage door. And this is one of my favorite features because it is a beacon of access that anybody walking by the theater can see, oh, that stage door has a ramp to it. And that just makes me so happy because it's so rare to
Yeah.
have access to these stage doors. So we have this big, beautiful silver ramp. I love it with all of my heart. And that leads to our stage door. And then from the stage door, there is an additional ramp that is very steep, but it is all that we could do given the parameters of the space because the stage door enters into a stairwell. So it was like you enter into a landing, you can either go downstairs or upstairs. So one of those staircases is ramped off. And then you're at stage level. And originally there was a space back there that had been used for many different things, storage, it had been like a wig room, it had been like the press area for a show, and they turned that into a dressing room complete with a bathroom. So immediately off stage there is a place for me to go that is completely accessible, and I share it with another actor who also had access needs and wasn't able to do stairs. So it's really great that this dressing room benefited multiple people. And it's also nice because like I get to share with somebody and oftentimes when people think of access, it becomes like, we built you a dressing room and now you are separated from everybody else. And in this situation, it was pretty much everybody in the show shares a dressing room with one other person. And so it was a really lovely way that we could share this space, and this space was totally accessible. And the other thing I love about it is then it becomes accessible to our guests and friends who might come backstage to do like a tour, to take a photo. I know I can invite my friends and that I'm not going to be worried about access issues or having to apologize for that, right? I know it's accessible, and that fills me with joy every day.
That's incredible. I mean, part of me thinks, well, yeah, of course, they should be putting those things in place to make it an accessible space for you, but it also doesn't happen super often, as we know
Mhm.
all too well, really, that people don't make adjustments for access and for all types of impairment groups as well. You know, it's not just step free, but there's so many other ways to make things accessible. But it is really wonderful to hear that they went through all of those steps to
Mhm.
make it accessible for you, but also, like you said, to future and other people as well. And that brings me to what I wanted to ask you about is like you said, you're the first wheelchair user to originate a role. Is that the
Mhm.
right sort of phrasing?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so I imagine that, I mean, being on Broadway alone, like you said, it's incredibly demanding and you're in front of all those people all the time. But I imagine that's an added pressure of like representation and, you know, all eyes sort of being on you as the first person to do that. Does that sort of feel scary or exciting to you?
To me, it's only exciting because there's kind of this trend in theater where whoever does the part first kind of sets the standard of how we think about that part. And whether this is, Kristen Chenoweth was the original Glinda, and now we think of Glinda as being, tiny little perky blonde women. And that has been a trend in the casting for that role. Or, if you think about like the original Phantom of the Opera, right? Like these voices that we think of, the movements that we think of, we tend to think of who did it first, and then everybody after that tends to like kind of imitate in a way. And whether it's because they're casting someone who looks similar or sounds similar, or because, for me, it was like my high school production of Oklahoma, we ended up just sounding like whoever said the line on the soundtrack, we said it the same way because that was just how you end up performing when you're a kid, a teenager, and a lot of adults too. But so for me, it was always exciting just knowing that in being in the original production, it would mean that in the future, the first thought for these characters would be making it inclusive, right? Perhaps having another disabled person playing these parts, perhaps having another wheelchair user playing these parts. And that had never happened before in a musical. So for me, the idea that Suffs will now forever have this legacy of inclusion, of access, that hopefully all future productions will think, oh, well, we could cast a disabled performer in this role, no problem, because that's the roadmap we've been given for this character. And I hope that it also means that all characters in the show people look at and go like, well, this show is inclusive, this show thinks about disability inclusion and access, and so therefore it becomes a part of the ethos of performing this show. And I hope that hopefully Suffs will run for a very, very long time. And it is certainly my hope that if and when I ever leave the show, that the next person who comes in also has a disability.
And do you know if the ambition when writing the musical was to purposefully include someone with a visible disability, perhaps a wheelchair user? Because, of course, there were disabled suffragettes in the UK. You know, we have Rosa May Billinghurst, who
Mm-hmm.
was a wheelchair user and was just an incredible person in the movement. But do you know if that was a conscious choice in sort of the writing and the casting, or was it that you auditioned and then they happened to change that character to fit you?
So Shayna Taub, who is our incredible writer and star of Suffs, she was very interested in, and as well as our director Lee Silverman, they were both very interested in having the performers in our show representing a full spectrum of what it means to be a woman in America. And so we tried to make a really diverse group of bodies and humans performing and telling this story so that any person watching the show can see themselves represented in this story and can see someone that they can relate to and connect with. So, from what I understand, it wasn't a specific, like, we want to find a wheelchair user to be in the show. It was, we are open to all kinds of diversity and are eager to hear those voices. So, I don't actually know, like, if I hadn't auditioned, if they would have hired another disabled person. But I do know that when I auditioned, they were excited to watch my audition because they were eager to include disability as part of the story. I also know that, like, Ali Stroker is a friend of Shayna's and did a very early reading of it. So disability and disabled actors have been a part of the story since the beginning. So even though none of our characters in our story have disabilities, I like to think about the fact that, like, disabled people were there. They were part of these movements. We just don't have the historical record that proves that. Disabled people have been a part of every major movement. Just because they're not written down in the history books doesn't mean they weren't there. And so I like to think that I am representing those voices that maybe were forgotten, but were a part of the fight. Our cast, I think, does a really great job of helping to represent some of those stories that are forgotten, because she told me at one point that she was looking high and low trying to find a disabled suffragist to reference in the story, and just kept coming up short. And we talked about Rosa May Billinghurst, but because she was in the UK, not the US, Shayna felt like she couldn't borrow the name or something. But it's an interesting thing to realize that just because someone isn't mentioned doesn't mean that they weren't there. And we're trying to at least allude to some of those voices.
Well, when you think about disability, I mean, you could say 1 in 4, some people say 1 in 5 people have a disability. So, like you said, there's no way that disabled people weren't there at,
Absolutely.
the time and taking part in these movements. And, something that was pointed out to me in another episode of this podcast where we were talking about like disabled people throughout history is that if you think about it, more people were probably disabled because of the lack of like medical treatments and things that we have now. So, there might have been more people who had various impairments, maybe because of the type of occupation that they had,
Yes.
or their lifestyle, or pollution, or, you name it. There probably were more disabled people. So, of course, they were in these movements. But you're right that those narratives aren't written down. I've been looking at doing maybe some research into Rosa May Billinghurst, but trying to find people who can speak to her life and her story, as even academics, it's really hard to find because, those stories are just put on the back burner, unfortunately.
Yeah. And I think that people are still so uncomfortable talking about disability, and it's getting better. We have platforms like this, but for so long I think that people did not self-identify as having a disability. And you'll kind of read history about someone and it'll be like, well, they had an affliction. It's like, we're going to allude to this, we're not going to say what it was. It's so common to read things like that and go like, oh, so they were disabled, but we're not going to go into it more. And then it's so hard to find out about, like, okay, well, what was their disability? What was their lived experience? Who were they? Because we're just not talking about it. We're not writing it down. And I think that now there's a movement towards like disability pride and owning, here's who I am. My disability is a part of who I am. And I'm going to proudly name that.
Yeah, as you said that, I'm also thinking about, when you read things like, some prince or whatever suffered ill health. It's like, again,
Yes.
what does that mean? What does that also look like in day to day? And then how did society respond to that? Were they like more accepting? Were they more exclusionary? I mean, it's funny you mentioned Phantom of the Opera because, in moments where, I'm really upset about the state of the world in regards to disabled people and sort of the ways that disabled people can be portrayed, I sort of think it's just like Phantom of the Opera, where,
Yes.
it's sort of like a freak show kind of,
Mhm.
scenario. Everyone points and like stare at and all of that, and they didn't realize and didn't give an opportunity to the fact that that character or that man in Phantom of the Opera also just happened to be a musical genius.
Mhm.
But it was so much more focused on that. So you do wonder what society's attitude to disability at those various points in history was. But you're
Mhm.
completely right. Now I'm thinking about all the various like biographies or snippets of biographies that you read. Yeah, you're right. It always alludes to something, but it never name it. They never tell
Yes.
you, they walked with a cane or they used a wheelchair, whatever it might be. And that's so
Mhm.
strange when you think about it now.
Yes. But I think of these as like I call them canonically disabled, where it's if
Yeah.
you're reading into, the Phantom of the Opera is a great example of like, this is a disabled character. And the way that we talk about him and the way we present him and the way we show him, like he is disabled. And
Oh,
yet no
a
one
hundred
thinks of
percent.
him as disabled. And I think there are so many examples like that. Even like if we're talking about like King George, right? He
Mm,
had a disability if we're
yeah.
really thinking about it and talking about it. But the way that it's like written about in history is, oftentimes it's like, oh, he was touched or he had an
Mm,
affliction. And it's like, well, these are ways of just talking around the issue. We need to just name what it is sometimes, and it is disability. And disability is a common lived experience. Most adults will become disabled at some point in their life. I would venture to say that everyone will become disabled at some point in their life, because if you don't, it's generally because you died before you gained a disability. So we need to actually be talking about disability and normalizing disability and making the world more accessible, because everybody has lived experience with disability at some point. And if we keep referring to these historical figures as non-disabled, like then we don't remember the history of what came before us and we can't learn from it and grow from it.
yeah, absolutely. And that's why, now, like you said, doing research for the show, the writer had so little like material to actually work with because
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't documented. But I wanted to talk about your acting history and like how you got to this point in your career. So you mentioned that, you were in school plays, school musicals, but what's been your journey as a disabled actor, particularly in the theater space?
Yeah. So I was always a very athletic kid. I loved, loved, loved playing sports. I have had a spinal cord injury since I was 16 months old. So I have, as long as I can remember, always had a disability, always walked with a limp and used a wheelchair from time to time. And as I got older, sports were a less and less safe environment for me. Not because the sport was was difficult, but because the attitudes became more toxic towards me. As sports became more competitive, it became just a less safe place. I will always remember I was playing volleyball when I was in middle school, and I loved volleyball. And the coach and parents for the other team started yelling, "Hit it to the crippled girl," because they
I'm
felt like I was a
sorry.
weakness on the team. Yes. And so, having that environment was not a great place for me. And
Oh,
my mother very wisely saw this, and she was like, you know what? You love singing, you love dancing. What if you auditioned for choir? What if you auditioned for a musical? And she really felt like I could get a similar active activity and teamwork and the things that I loved about sports from a different outlet. And so when I was in middle school, had me audition for choir and for theater, and I immediately fell in love. And it was a much better environment for me. In addition to that, in Colorado, there is a theater company called Family, spelled Phamally, and they exclusively cast actors with disabilities. And so around that time, my mom discovered Family and asked me if I wanted to audition for their summer musical. And I absolutely fell in love, found a wonderful community of fellow disabled artists, and performed there. I still perform there when I can, but it became a really wonderful home for me and a place for me to learn about, myself as a disabled person and myself as a disabled artist, and how to, make accommodations for myself, and how to discover characters and how my disability might inform those, conversations you weren't having in other theater classes, but that were integrated so beautifully into the fabric of Family. So once I found Family, I knew that it was all I wanted to do for the rest of my life, was just perform. When I got to high school and college, started auditioning for more theater companies in the area, and went to the University of Denver's Lamont School of Music and was a music major, a vocal performance major, and graduated school and just kept auditioning. And it was just, I had never thought of auditioning for Broadway, to be completely frank and honest about it, partly because like I hadn't seen anybody like me on Broadway. I didn't think that disabled people had a place on Broadway, and I knew that the buildings were super inaccessible, and just kind of put it out of my mind. It was like easier to think I won't be there than to want to be there and be told no. So I didn't think it was ever going to be part of my personal trajectory. But I'd started working at theater companies across the country. And then during the pandemic, I was at home on my couch and had to audition for a certain number of shows per month in order to collect my unemployment. And the public theater had an audition announcement for, they called it a new musical called Suffragist. And it was like a workshop for SUPs. I just thought to myself, like, well, I'm sitting here. I have to audition for things anyway. Might as well audition for the Pipe Dreams, because like in my mind, I was like, I'm not going to be cast anyway. So I might as well like audition for the biggest things I can find, just to say I did it. And happened to get a call a few weeks later from the casting team asking for an additional callback. And then I did a Zoom callback, and it eventually led to me being cast in SUFs at the Public. And that was in 2021 was my first workshop for that. So, you never know where your path is going to lead you. When I was 6 years old, if you'd asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I probably would have said a cheerleader, right? Or like, would have said a veterinarian or an astronaut. And as time went on, I fell in love with the community that theater provides and the relationships, and also just getting to perform and getting to tell these stories. And I never thought my path would have led to New York, but I'm so grateful that the universe interceded and kind of pushed me towards being here.
I mean, there's so much in what you just said that I want to ask you about. I mean, first, like, I'm devastated for you to have had that experience in sports. I mean, that comment in particular, I think, is one of the most unhinged kind of
Mm-hmm.
comments I've heard in a long time, but those really do stick with you. And I mean, I have to ask, like, did anyone call them out? I mean, obviously you were playing volleyball at the time. It's not really fair on you to sort of like go and have to tell this parent that you don't know, don't say that to me. But was there anyone who like intervened on your behalf in that scenario?
What's interesting about it is that like I didn't know about it at the time. My
Oh,
mom
okay.
heard it, and I didn't know about it, and she didn't tell me. It
Mm,
was years later that somebody else who knew the story, I was talking to them, and they were like, "Oh yeah, your mom was telling about that time that those awful parents and coaches said that thing." And I was like, what are you talking about? I had
that's,
never heard it. My mom had really protected me from it. I can't imagine how awful that was for her.
yeah.
And I don't know what she did. I know that I stopped playing volleyball the next year. And she always gave me the option of like, I could continue playing volleyball, but she really,
Mm,
started encouraging me to be in other spaces. So it was my choice to go elsewhere, but I really applaud her for acknowledging, like, this is not a safe space to be in anymore. I don't know if she confronted them or if my coach confronted them, but
mm,
I was really insulated and protected from it. And I'm grateful for that because I think I
yeah.
was too young at the time to really be able to process that or deal with that. Now as an adult, I think about it and I still don't know what I would do. Like if I heard that today.
Yeah. Because I think we, as disabled people, can sometimes get, don't want to say quite desensitized, but like kind of. And I can imagine, with you putting yourself in the public eye so much. I mean, we invite comments, I guess, from
Hmm.
people, and not all people are good people. But I find those moments of when something is said to you that is just below your bottom line, or a situation happens that you're so taken aback by that you don't know how you would respond. I think it'd be really easy to say like, "Oh, I would have gone and like yelled at that person,"
Hmm.
but it it hits you in very strange ways and in unexpected ways when you're confronted with negative attitudes, and in that case, just sickening attitudes
Yeah.
from other people to not only
Hmm.
call you that, but to also then try and encourage their kid to
Yeah.
use your, I don't know, perceived weakness, and that's in air quotes, to
Hmm.
win their game. I mean, I think
Yeah.
that,
It's gross. This is children we're talking about. It's children's sports.
yeah,
And the ableism was so ingrained in these adults that they couldn't even let their children play sports. And like,
yeah,
I look at it like it could have been such a positive experience for these kids all around. You're playing sports with people of different
yeah,
physical abilities and seeing that people with disabilities are fantastic at playing sports sometimes, right?
yeah,
Just like people with disabilities are fantastic in all sorts of realms and areas. Media doesn't show us that. Media doesn't tell us that. It could have been a great lesson for them of, oh, great, yeah, disabled people play volleyball. Cool. Moving
mm,
on. And instead it became, oh, disabled people are weak and we should exploit that. That was what the parents were teaching them.
yeah,
And it breaks my heart to think about. And
mm,
every time I've been faced with it, because it happens, right? Whether it's
yeah,
in person that people say horrible things or especially online, I've never been good at reacting to it in the moment. I tend to have these very delayed reactions where in the moment I'm just always shocked. I never get used to it. Every time it happens, I'm just shocked and surprised and silent, and then later have to process that.
And in your sort of now incredibly public facing career, you're trying to provide this much needed representation for kids that are disabled now that want to be able to see themselves in different walks of life and different,
Mm-hmm.
career pathways and stuff. What have you found the reception is to there being a disabled person in this production? Because I think there are productions that can really pride themselves on diversity and inclusion. I think that's wonderful, but
Mm-hmm.
ultimately it's being consumed by other people. So yeah, how's the reception been?
I have really found the reception to be only positive. Now, that's with the caveat of I do not have a very active social media. I have a rule of never reading comments. I've tried to protect myself from strangers who don't know me, who didn't see the show, who might be saying things that they don't actually have knowledge of. But when it comes to our show and getting to talk to people at the stage door every day, every single night, I meet people who tell me how important it was to them to see a wheelchair user on stage, to see a disabled person on stage. and to see a disabled person playing non-disabled roles, because most of Broadway, we see non-disabled people playing disabled roles. So when you
Mm.
do see a wheelchair user on Broadway, such as in Wicked, you're not going to be seeing a disabled person in that role necessarily. So I have really treasured having conversations with our audience members, and some of those audience members have disabilities themselves. Many of them are speaking on behalf of a friend or a sibling or a parent who has a disability, and they were so happy to see it in honor of that person, or just people who are wonderful allies who are excited about finally seeing disabled people performing on stage. Because, as you said, so many companies celebrate their diversity, but oftentimes when you're thinking of diversity, disability is left out of that conversation. So you'll go see a show that, Shucked, for example, had this great joke in it of like, we're a diverse group of pilgrims. And their cast was wonderfully diverse, but there was not a visibly disabled person on that stage. So it
Mm.
adds another element to this conversation of having a diverse company. And I have found that our audiences really, really, really respond to that in a very positive way.
I mean, that's incredible to hear. And I can just imagine how, like, reaffirming those conversations are, to hear how people are saying it's important because it is, it's huge. It means that, someone who may, like you say, love Broadway and may always have wanted to be in that career path just ruled themselves out and didn't
Mm-hmm.
find, that inclusive start or that first company that was going to allow them to develop without hiding or trying to dampen down a disability, but to really explore your craft as an actor and what it means to be disabled or play a non-disabled character as a disabled person. It's so important that those pieces of representation are there so that it eventually disability can't continue to be ignored.
Yes. There's this Oscar Wilde quote that I'm going to paraphrase slightly because I can't remember it verbatim, but he says that life imitates art far more than art imitates life. And
Mm,
I love it so much because I think of how often we see things on TV and on stage and in movies, and we want our lives to look like what we see. And it oftentimes isn't the other way around, right? If you're watching TV, that's not what your life looks like, but we want it to, we aspire to this. So if we have disability as part of that art, suddenly we can imagine things like, for SUPs, not only is it, oh my gosh, disabled people can be actors on Broadway, but I play a senator and I play a police officer and I play a journalist in the show. And suddenly you go, oh, great, disabled people can be senators, disabled people can be journalists, disabled people can be activists. And it suddenly opens up your perspectives of what you can do and what disability can do.
so in terms of future roles for you, because I was obviously looking at your website and all the amazing roles that you've done. And I mean, the roles that you've played are, at least in the way that I understand some of those characters, like you'd be Lady Macbeth, and you were,
Mhm.
I couldn't tell if it was Mary or Mary Magdalene in Jesus Christ Superstar.
Yes, Mary Magdalene.
Okay, so like these aren't characters that we typically think of as disabled. So, like, what attracts you to roles? Like, would you be averse to playing a disabled written character? Is that something that like you're less interested in? Do you want to do non-disabled roles? Like, what appeals to you the most?
Um, Humanity appeals to me. So I love to play a wide range of characters. And I've played lots of disabled roles. I've played Laura in Glass Menagerie. I've played Richard III. There's not very many disabled roles. Like my resume doesn't
Yeah.
have a lot of disabled roles on it because there aren't very many out there. And to add to that, most of those characters were written by non-disabled people who don't understand the disabled experience. So many of the disabled roles out there I'm not interested in because it's what a non-disabled person thinks it's like to be disabled. I don't find them very interesting. I don't find them very authentic. I love playing disabled roles written by disabled writers. I want more of those. And I've been lucky enough to do a couple of workshops for new shows and new plays that are written by disabled writers. And those characters are amazing. I want to play more of those. I love playing disabled characters when they are written in a three-dimensional way. I want to just uplift and support disabled writers out there because we need those voices. So in the absence of those roles, I love characters that I can bring my disability to them because I am always disabled. No matter what role I'm playing, I, Jenna, am always disabled. So even if my character might not be disabled, the audience is still going to see my wheelchair. That audience is still going to see if I'm walking, they're going to see me limping. So I love characters that I think about, how does this fit in their body? What might have been their history or their experience of disability. They might not identify as disabled, but they might have a disability. It might be temporary, it might be permanent, but I love to find motivation for that. One of my favorite examples was I played Belle in Beauty and the Beast. And for me, it suddenly illuminated so much of why Belle is viewed as an outcast within her community. It's never really explained in the movie, in the play of, she's just odd, right? And this kind of comes back to
Yeah.
our first conversation of like, could odd just be a euphemism? Is she actually
Oh
disabled?
my gosh.
And
Yeah,
I think
because
she is.
I'm just thinking from like the very first opening song. You're right. They're saying how she's odd, she doesn't fit in, she's peculiar. Oh my
hmm
God, do I need to
Yep. So
rewatch
I
this?
think I think that Belle is neurodivergent personally. And I think that that is part of why she's ostracized. And I think that's part of why she and the Beast connect because the Beast is also obviously disabled, right?
It
Canonically
it's like the
disabled.
Phantom of the Opera kind of
hmm
character, different, shunned from society.
Yes. Yes. And like, transformed into a hideous beast to me is a euphemism. It's
Yeah.
just he has a disability and is hidden away from society. And so when Belle comes,
Wow.
they immediately have something in common. And that also frees both of them because they're no longer hiding or feeling like outcasts. They're able to find community and companionship and solace in each other being themselves.
Yeah.
And I think it's a beautiful lens through which to tell a story that we might not see unless there is a visibly disabled person portraying those characters.
I mean, that's fascinating. Now that like you've explored the character in that way because it makes so much sense when you look at it that way. And
Mm-hmm.
obviously, with fairy tales and whatnot, like there isn't a way to know what the original writer intended, but that's such an interesting interpretation of that character that I never would have thought about. I think, when you were like going to think about Disney and, sort of like those types of roles, like maybe Little Mermaid question mark, like
Mm-hmm.
around disability, but that's like a little bit more obvious, like speaking, all of that. But that's so interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Are there
Disability is really at the heart of so many fairy tales if you're looking for it.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. I mean, it goes to a lot of conversations I'm sure you've seen around particularly people with like facial differences, and they're
Mm-hmm.
typically those actors are cast as villains, and
Yes.
sort of like the Phantom of the Opera, the Beast, like they are visibly different, therefore
Mm-hmm.
bad. And,
Mm-hmm.
that good and bad in those interpretations are very prevalent in in fairy tales, but even in Richard III, right?
Yes.
The
Yes.
ways that you can interpret that character and thinking about, okay, well, what is the text? And then what is the way, like you said, how do we imagine that character based on what we've seen before? And when we've
Mhm.
seen people portray Richard III as very like hunchback and like really lean into sort of those visible differences, that becomes in our head who Richard III was. I know
Mhm.
that's slightly different because of course he was a real person, but
Yeah.
it's now a character to so many
Yes.
people. So
Yes.
what is the dream character for you to play? I mean, is it I have to admit, so I haven't seen Wicked because I tried to see it in Chicago as a kid, for when I grew up. I had an asthma attack halfway through the show and I had to
No,
leave. And of course, I can't see it in London because of the inaccessible
because of the
theater.
lift.
But yeah, damn things. But is that a character that you want to play? Does she have much of a character?
Yeah, I mean, Nessa Rose is a wheelchair user and is an ambulatory wheelchair user if you're really watching the show, because there is a point
Mm.
where Elphaba bewitches Nessa Rose's shoes so that she is able to walk. And
Oh,
it's kind of an
interesting.
important plot point in the show. And it's part of why disabled people don't often play that part, because there's a lack of imagination about wheelchair users.
Yeah,
And people think of wheelchair use as a binary of
yeah.
you are a full-time wheelchair user, you are unable to walk or stand in any capacity, is kind of
Mhm.
the idea that people have of wheelchair users, even though we know that the majority of wheelchair users are able to walk or stand in some capacity with or without assistance. So there's a lot of people out there who could authentically play Nessa Rose. She only has to take like 2 steps, and you could block it in a way that she, has assistance or has a walker or a cane. Anyway, I
Yeah.
could go on about that. So I would love to play Nessa Rose for simply the fact of what it represents. This is one of the most famous disabled characters in the musical theater canon, and on stage has never been portrayed by an actual wheelchair user. I would love to be able to change that narrative. I am so excited for the casting in the new movie because the actress who has been cast as Nessa Rose is a wheelchair user. And I am so, so excited that that narrative is finally being reclaimed by the disabled community. And I hope that
Mm.
Broadway and the West End follow suit. I hope that they start to cast disabled people in those roles. So I would be honored to play that part. Once again, it is a character written by non-disabled people.
Yeah.
So I, as a character, find her a little less interesting, but for what she represents, I love her. My real dream, I want the stories of disabled leaders and activists to be told, and I want to tell those stories. I want to play Judy Human. I want to play Kitty Cone. I love these humans. I want their stories told, and I would love to be a part of that. And I want to tell stories that people have historically not thought about disability as being a part of them. I want to make people rethink how they are viewing, love stories. I want to just be the romantic lead in a Hallmark movie. I want people to think about disabled
Yeah.
people as falling in love, as being romantic, as being sexual. I want to be a disabled lawyer in a TV show. I want people to think about disabled people as being smart and feisty. And,
Yeah.
I want to change the narratives of how people view disability. And that's what I'm most excited about.
I mean, I am a huge admirer of Judy Human and the work that she did. And I just want to sort of wrap us up by saying, I don't know if you're aware of this, but I believe it's in workshop, a musical is trying to be made of the sit-ins that Judy Human orchestrated for Section 504.
Yes.
which looks like such an interesting project. And again, it's when I read Judy Human's book and heard those stories, it's one of those, how the hell did they not teach us this? Because
Yes.
you can't even comprehend now that many disabled people, occupying a government building and telling that story. I can just imagine would be incredibly fun, but also really, really important. So if the people making that show are listening to this, please cast the wonderful Jenna as Judy Human, because I think that would be phenomenal. But I wanted to just say a huge, huge thank you to you to coming on this podcast and for telling us all about your career and what it is like to be on Broadway. I'm not at all envious, but I am so, so excited that we got to have this conversation.
I'm so honored to have been here today and to get to talk with you, Emma. It's been such a joy. And if you're ever in New York, I hope that we can hang out, come see stuff. Our theater is accessible. Um, and yeah, it's been just so much fun.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Wheelchair Activist. If you want to stay up to date and catch all of our previous episodes, you can find them all on my website, thewheelchairactivist.com. You can also follow me on social media at emma.vogelman on most platforms. And if you'd like to support the podcast, our links to the GoFundMe and Buy Me a Coffee are in this episode description. Your support in whatever form means the absolute world to us, and I'm so excited to bring you another episode next month. See you then.